So should I?
Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Methods Guru for Sage Method Space, and I'm happy to be joined today by co-authors Bethany Morgan Brett and Katy Wheeler, who have a new book out about qualitative interviewing. But before we get started, if you are new to Method Space, this is a blog community hosted by Sage Publishing, and we're interested in all things to do with planning, designing, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, and sharing results in ways that will make a difference. And you can see at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we feel that whether you are a brand new researcher, a student, or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. So to get started, why don't you introduce yourselves?
So hi, I'm Bethany Morgan Brett. I'm a primarily qualitative researcher who's been researching for almost 20 years now. I call myself a psychosocial researcher because I'm interested in how we can use clinical techniques from psychoanalysis and use them and apply them within the qualitative research methods framework. And last year I made the move during the coronavirus pandemic to actually becoming a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. So I'm doing that now, which is using some of my interviewing techniques as well within the clinical frame.
Right. And we have a lot of method space readers who are, I think, interested in how some of the academic skills that we learn as researchers can, apply in other settings. So, thank you. And so, Katy?
Hi there, I'm Katy Wheeler. I'm a lecturer in sociology at the University of Essex. My research has really been around areas of sustainability and sustainable consumption. I've done a number of different types of interviews, from household interviews, talking to people about the sorts of things that they buy and why they buy things, and how they understand sustainable choices, but also talking to people like in expert roles like government, policymakers, etc. So Bethany and I have quite different skill sets, but I think that is what really complements us coming together in this book and in other things that we do together.
Well, and your experience really resonates with the theme we are focusing on method space right now, concerning research about hot button controversial issues, which certainly the environmental matters that you look at, Katy, some people find difficult or controversial, and then also about sensitive topics and vulnerable participants, which connects with Bethany's work. So I'd like to just ask you both to talk a little bit about what you would suggest to researchers who are, planning to, go into, studies that might be in either of those situations, thinking about that, for interview researcher, whether we are live and in person or whether we are on a video conferencing platform like we are right now, it's a little bit different. We're coming face to face with participants versus, other kinds of research like using secondary data or big data or doing surveys or something where, we can't see the person crying or the person who is maybe upset by the questions. As an interview researcher, we need to be prepared for that. So I wondered if you could just provide a little bit of tips for your experience that might help a researcher going into a situation of that kind. So Bethany, are you going to start?
Yeah, I'll start. So primarily my research has been on the aging process, and overall my main project was on midlife crisis and how people experience aging as they move through the life course. And I'm also interested in death and bereavement as research topics. So naturally, incredibly emotive and often upsetting subjects. I'm currently writing a book about the death of parents and how parents at the end of life move into institutional care as well. So that's also incredibly upsetting research for many people. And yes, there's a lot to be said about emotions and how we manage emotions within qualitative research. There will be many different topics which will be, inherently upsetting, whether it's aging and death, or whether it's talking about some like prejudices, sexuality, racism, migration. There's lots of, even, global issues that Katy covers. All of these things will have real sensitivities. And so, as talking to you as researchers, there may be something within your research aim which may trigger upsetting emotions for your participants, and could be quite triggering. And this, for you as a researcher, could be quite emotionally draining and tiring and exhausting. And you may also find yourself it triggering your own emotional responses. It might make you as a researcher feel upset too. I think one of the first tips to sort of suggest is that it's important to not be afraid of your own emotional response, but at the same time make your participants' story the priority. If your participant, for example, starts crying, then it's okay to cry with them. Sometimes that happens, but really you don't want to be the first person that cries with the emotional story. Just see how much you can hold back on crying with them, but it's okay to cry with them. It's obviously an upsetting thing. Something just fell over outside. I'm not sure what that is. Ronnie. But it's really important what we do in psychoanalysis is contain emotions, basically hold on to them for the other person. It's about, and this is actually a real skill to be able to do. Sometimes participants might find that talking about something really upsetting feels a bit like free therapy. And I've had instances in the past where I've interviewed people and gone, they've said at the end, oh, wow, that was amazing. That was like having free counselling. Thank you very much. So don't assume that if someone is crying that they want to stop the interview or that they need to end. It can be quite cathartic. It can release a lot of emotions for somebody, and people get the opportunity to talk about something that perhaps no one's ever asked them about. It's about the opportunity for someone to tell their story. So
in some ways it's kind of a validation that their emotions or their difficult experience is meaningful.
Yeah, and that you as the receiver, as the listener to that story, the receiver of that story, are able to hold on to that story for them and not be too frightened by it or emotionally defended by it. Because it would, for example, when some of my undergraduate students in the past have done more sensitive research, they've sometimes just cut the interview dead. They've gone, oh, sorry, you're crying, let's finish the interview there, and then they've just left. And that's not what you should be doing. You should not be just cutting the interview dead. You should give your participant the option as to what they want to do. So if your participant, for example, starts crying, then you say, would you like me to stop the tape for a moment? Would you like a cup of tea? Would you like something to soothe them in that moment? And to be honest, almost everyone that's cried in my interviews, and which is quite a lot, I think there's only ever been one that said, yes, can I just pause for a moment while I just compose myself? Everybody else has said, do you know what, I'm happy to continue. So that's sort of how you would manage crying within an interview, for example. In terms of it being considered like free therapy, it's important to remember that as researchers, you're not a counsellor, you're not their therapist, and you're not there to offer advice or offer interpretations on what they might be thinking and feeling. You're not there to kind of dig into that. There's quite a significant difference between therapy and qualitative interviewing in that with interviewing, you're likely only to see your participant once, maybe twice, not usually over an extended period of time where you can facilitate interpretations. And the other difference is that in counselling, the patient would seek out the therapist, whereas in interviewing, as a researcher, you're seeking out your participants. So that's a different power dynamic that arises between the two of you. And there's an intensity of a relationship between a therapist and their patient, which is sometimes lacking. You can build rapport with your participant in a 1 or 2 series interviews with your participants, but it's not the same as seeing somebody for a whole year, for example. And there's a certain amount of skill within being a psychoanalyst or a therapist or a counsellor, which perhaps we don't get that training as qualitative researchers. We've got a different aims and objectives. We're not there to fix somebody or to make them feel better. We're there to uncover their story. And
So would you suggest that someone, as you're talking about that, sort of holding your emotion and being more responsive to the participant, but not letting your emotions kind of overwhelm you, is that something that you would suggest the researchers practice, doing practice interviews, or how would they build those skills?
It may be difficult to do practice runs because you don't want to go around intentionally upsetting people to see if you can get practice in containing their emotions. I think it's about being reflective about your interviewing style and thinking about how could I have asked that question differently. So once you've done one interview, how could I have asked that differently? How could I have dealt with that differently? Because that's something that will evolve over time. Certainly reading up on skills and understanding that understanding the concept of containment, of being able to hold on to somebody's emotions, I think is important. So reading around maybe some of that more sort of counselling literature can help with that.
So Katy, with your research into topics that are sensitive in other ways that may have, political or, other kind of controversial aspects, what do you suggest to researchers?
I mean, I was just thinking when Bethany was defining, the sensitive interview, that one thing that we can't always be certain of when we're doing qualitative interviewing is that it's not going to get sensitive, because actually what we're talking to people about is about their own individual life stories, perhaps the way that they deal with quite complex and difficult issues in a political sense. So we can never know sometimes whether or not that interview is going to become a sensitive interview. So I think in terms of how we prepare our interviewees for these possibilities, I think we need to make sure that when we are recruiting interviewees, we are clear with them about what to expect in an interview encounter. So although sometimes those procedural things around participant information sheets and ethics forms, they're really important, and we need to take particular care in terms of how we present our research to people, so that they know what they're getting into.
Right.
Because I think sometimes, I remember quite clearly doing an interview with a community gardener, and it was about sustainability and like what she'd done in her local community. And I didn't really imagine that I was walking into an interview that was going to be sensitive. I thought I was going to be talking to her about community scheme that she'd set up, and I remember that she broke down in tears during this interview, and it wasn't something that I was expecting, but because of her story and where she'd come from and all the things that had happened, she just felt very overwhelmed in that moment. one thing I always say to people is like, we don't know where qualitative interviewing
Right.
might take us. And, just because it doesn't feel like it's a sensitive, emotional topic, it actually still might end up going that way because we're dealing with people's kind of everyday stories, aren't we? So I think that's one element. And then the other thing I wanted to say was about interviewing around topics that perhaps might evoke feelings of guilt, particularly when we're talking about things like climate change and sustainability, and when we're talking about people's everyday practices. So I think we have to be quite careful about how we frame our questions and how we try and elicit people's narratives around this, so that it's not as though we are judging them through the questions that we ask, and thinking about and ask questions creatively so that they don't automatically become defended against the ways that we ask them. So I think that's another point to think about. Right.
So I like your comments about the informed consent process, because to me there's I think many researchers focus on the consent part of it. We need to get these forms filled out, but I like to emphasize the informed part of it, and those exchanges that you have through kind of the recruitment and determination that somebody's going to fit the study, and the preparation stage that gives you a chance to maybe learn a little bit about the person and their attitudes that might help you to have a little more knowledge going into it, as well as for them to have more understanding about where you're coming from, and that, like you say, that you're not trying to frame them for their bad behavior or make an example of their bad behavior, but to learn about their motivations and what's really going on. And I think sometimes talking about how the research will be used can be helpful in reassuring someone to know that you're you're looking for new understandings that can help to inform policies and practices, or whatever might be helpful. So as you've talked about both kind of preparing yourself for an interview, looking at the kinds of questions that you ask, really being careful about the ways that they are framed, and ways of handling difficult situations within an interview. And certainly these are topics that you cover in your new book. So perhaps you can tell our viewers a little bit more about your new book, and who might benefit from.
Yeah, our new book, which has just been published, is titled How to Do Qualitative Interviewing, and it really is, I would say, a hand-holding guide for somebody who has never done an interview before. We really try and take you through the whole process of developing your, deciding whether or not, in the first place, whether or not interviews are actually right for your project, because I know lots of people assume that qualitative interview is appropriate, but actually it does depend upon the research question that you have. And then once we've determined whether or not you do want to do a qualitative interview, then we sort of take you through the different styles of qualitative interview, how to go about writing a interview guide, how to try and recruit participants, and then thinking about how you manage that encounter. And we spend quite a lot of time thinking about interviewing skills and how you can develop those through various different activities. And these are things that you can, you don't have to be in a classroom to do this. You can try these things at home yourself, and you can learn through that process. I think we really place an emphasis on reflexivity and keeping a constant check on what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, and keeping a record of that, because that's really important when you come to write up that research. And then both, obviously, as I said at the beginning, Bethany and I have very different kind of backgrounds in interviewing. I think that's what really complements the book, is that we can come to it with those different backgrounds, but also we come to it, I hope, quite honestly, in the sense that we do share quite a lot of the mistakes that we've made along the way, because interviewing is a process that you learn by doing, and we have made a number of mistakes along the way, and we try to be honest about those and say, well, what could we have done to minimize that? What could we have done differently? And that's, we're kind of hoping to model the things that we want to take forward.
I think there's certainly a lot of literature available about interview research and qualitative research from a more conceptual level, but I think it's quite valuable to have something that is this kind of practical guide. And, especially since the two of you are kind of, as you say, you're walking the talk in using interview skills, both in academic and non-academic setting. Who do you think will benefit from this book? How might this help, people who are either independent researchers or are doing research as a part of other kinds of professional work?
Well, we're both we've both been lecturers in qualitative research methods, and I think we sort of identified a gap within the market for a book which was aimed really primarily at a very introductory level, but which was really giving a really honest and candid account of the mistakes that we made, like Katie said. It's about so we wrote it for undergraduate students who are starting out for their research projects or dissertations, and we also based it upon our Essex summer school materials that we've run Essex Summer School qualitative research methods for about 8 years, I think now. And these, again, are mostly master's students and PhD students who have no background in qualitative research. So they're starting from scratch. And this was meant to be a really easy, practical, introductory book, which was giving a really honest account of our journey of research as well, so that students weren't too bogged down in a lot of the detail that some of the other books on the market have.
Right.
I mean, I think, as I say,
I've learned recently just the trend towards more mixed methods styles of research, that people are seeing this as being kind of the wave of things to come, that while there are people who use big data and surveys and other kinds of broad brush quantitative methods, seeing the need to add in the stories behind the numbers and the dimension. So while, as you say, this is a book that you targeted initially to kind of beginner students, I think, for experienced researchers who now, want to add in an additional method to have a more robust study, might find this to be useful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Katy,
we try to be quite introductory in our approach and tone, so anyone really can come to this without any kind of training in qualitative methods, and we hope that by the end of the book you'll feel more confident to go out and try those techniques. And as Bethany said, we've had quite a lot of experience of taking novice researchers with no experience of interviewing up to the point of doing their research projects.
Right. Well, thank you both for joining me, and for the dog. I've read recently that one of the things people don't like about going back to the physical workplace now is that there aren't babies and cats and kind of the interruptions that make us feel like we're a part of real life. So we have a little of that here today. So thanks for
they just wanted to be famous.
Yes, right. Yeah. So thank you for giving some practical ideas that researchers can use, and then talking a little bit about your book, so interested readers.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you very much.